So we have here a theory of change with some indicators for a cancer support charity who are based in Scotland. And this document is in the middle of being developed, and they've asked for some comments at this stage to see if we're on the right lines. So the thing to say about any development of a theory of change document is to make sure to always involve lots of different stakeholders. So not just an impact or an evaluation specialist, but involve your service users, your partners, your funders, your donors and other supporters. And make sure that everyone is involved in that process who has a stake in your work. The other thing with that theory of change document is just to be clear on the purpose of it and who it's actually for. You might even end up having several iterations of a theory of change, or several different versions, depending on who the audience is. So if it's for the public, it might be a much simpler document, and if it's for internal staffing, it might be more complex. There might be supplementary documents to it, for example. So those are just some things to bear in mind generally when developing a theory of change. Now, my initial impression of this theory of change was that it's a very neatly presented document. I think it has a very clear linear nature to it. Now, of course, a theory of change doesn't have to be linear, but what struck me about this one was that it was very clear. And you've got those different colours denoting the three different strands, and that was immediately stuck out for me. And it flows really clearly, like a logic model from left to right. You'd expect to see those activities at the beginning. So what it is that you're delivering behind the scenes to make everything happen, right through to the change that you're trying to achieve in the short and medium term, right through to what that ultimate impact is, going from left to right. So that's really clear and logical. I also like the fact that your different elements are united really clearly. So in that final section under the changes we want to see, I really like that you've united that whole first strand by explaining that's about providing better cancer services, and the next one's about better community support, and the final one's about the collective cancer voice informed policy and practice. And then you've gone to the final stage where you've united all of those three broad strands into your final desired impact, which is that people affected by cancer have better experience and support. So I think that's really clear about what your ultimate goal is and how everything feeds into that. Under our approach as well, if we look in a little bit more detail, I really like the things that you've considered under our approach. I would consider those approaches. I wouldn't consider them outcomes or outputs necessarily, and I think people often confuse what each of those mean, but those really are very clear approaches, I think, there. So that's my overall impression. A comment on the objectives over here. Now, I'm looking from an external person's perspective. It might be a little bit confusing to an external person why, for example, objective 2 is different in your first strand compared to your second strand. Now, I imagine that there is another strategy or supporting document that these objectives relate to, but it's not necessarily clear to me as an external person. So maybe you want to provide a link to what that's referring to, or maybe you don't need to include those numbers there if it's an external audience, for example. But as I say, it does come back to who your audience is and the kind of knowledge that you would expect them to have. The very first column, you have your activities listed out here. Now, I'm just wondering if it might be more helpful to divide up your activities into two different things, into your processes. So that's what needs to happen behind the scenes. And then your outputs, which are what you deliver on the front line. So what you deliver to your end users. Now, those end users might be your staff, or they might be people affected by cancer. But it might just help to separate those out, because when it comes to thinking about your indicators, you might want to measure them slightly differently. So, for example, here, your your staff training, if your staff training are your end users, then those are going to be some of your outputs. Maybe your newsletter is an output. But training PABC, for example, if that needs to happen behind the scenes in order to deliver and that's going to be part of your processes. People recruited to the engagement network, well, recruitment needs to happen behind the scenes, so that's going to be part of your process. The engagement network itself, once people are recruited, that's going to be your output. So it might just help just to divide those up separately and then think about measuring them separately as well. The outcomes, both short-term and medium-term, I think are really good. I think they're really clear outcomes. You have a very clear direction of change through your wording. So you're talking about more people, or increased number, or being more able, or amplifying and more of our work, and so on. And those kinds of words are really appropriate to have for outcomes. They denote that direction of change. And I think that's something, again, that often people confuse. Often they put what they're actually delivering under their outcomes. But the outcomes are about that desired change that you want to achieve. And you've really hit the nail on the head there, I think. So moving on to indicators then, because these are the trickiest, and I know that these are still being developed in your case. What the question I find most helpful to ask myself when I'm thinking about what indicators I need are, well, twofold really. What do I want to be able to prove, and what do I want to be able to improve? Now, when you ask those two questions, I think it just helps to really prioritize then what it is that you need to measure, because there are a million and one things you could be measuring, I'm sure, but it can be quite difficult to prioritize. Now, the sorts of things that you're going to want to have indicators for, I would recommend having some measures or indicators for your activities in your first column there. And as I said, maybe if you separate those out, you'll have some indicators for your processes and some indicators for your outputs. You certainly are going to want to have some indicators for your outcomes. Your short-term outcomes are going to be easier to measure. Hopefully those are the sorts of things that you can achieve within a business year and demonstrate clear progress on. But it's also going to be important to measure your medium-term outcomes, that maybe they take a little bit longer to achieve. Maybe they talk more over a 3 to 5 year period. So maybe you're going to want to measure them slightly differently. Maybe the resources to measure those are going to be different, or the timing or the frequency is going to be different, but still important to measure. And of course, finally, your impact. You're absolutely going to want to measure whether you've had your desired impact or not. But because impact is such big change and can take place over years and years and years, the resources that you're going to use to be able to measure your impact is going to be very different from your outcomes. And it might not even be that you're in a position yourself to measure that. Maybe you can't reach out to every person affected by cancer to understand if you've had an impact, but maybe you can rely on other organisations' data, such as hospital trusts, or maybe there are some national attitudinal surveys, for example. But impact indicators are really important, but they're probably going to look quite different from your other indicators. Now, something to be wary of in your indicators column, you do actually have a mix of indicators and outcomes. So a few things that you've mentioned aren't measures, they are outcomes. So increased awareness amongst staff of what matters to PABC, increased opportunities for people to co-produce, staff feel more informed about what engagement of PABC means for their work. All of those are actually outcomes. We can see that they're outcomes because they tell us about that direction of change. So increased and more informed and so on. So We want to take those out of the indicators, but we do need to measure them somehow. So, for example, staff feel more informed about what engagement of PABC means for their work. Well, perhaps in that circumstance, you might have an indicator which is your self-reported level of understanding from staff of PABC's relevance to their work. And that would be your indicator, and them feeling more informed would be your outcome. So have a look through those indicators again and ask which are measures and which are outcomes. An indicator is always expressed neutrally. So where you have numbers of staff trained, number of insight reports and so on, they are all indicators. Indicators are phrased as numbers of, or levels of, or percentages of, or categories of, or types of, or whether or not something, for example. But they are always neutral. They are simply the measure. If your outcome, for example, is to lose weight, then your indicator is going to be the number of pounds on the scale, for example. So we're not talking about things going up or down or staying the same. We're not talking about targets or baselines and attaching a specific number. All we're saying is what is the neutral measure that we're going to use. So go back and pick out the indicators from the outcomes. And then just a few general comments overall. Make sure that you're clear to explain what acronyms mean. Now, I appreciate that if this is an internal document, there might be an expectation that staff already know what these are, but even internally, when you've got new staff coming on board or volunteers, for example, who are reading this document, explaining the acronyms can be quite helpful. So the ones I notice are PABC, we've got ABCD events, and we've got DS celebration events. And again, depending on the audience, if this is for the public, one exercise you could do is see if you could get this to fit neatly onto an A4 piece of paper with a size 14 font. And one of the ways you might do that is taking out the indicators. If it's for the public, for example, that's probably not so helpful for them to know. You could always put that into a separate document, a monitoring and evaluation framework, for example, where you can include that level of detail. But you could format the document in different ways depending on the audience. And of course, I'm sure you're going to go through a branding comms exercise, just making sure that the colours match up with the colour palette, and that your tone of voice used in your theory of change matches with what your organisation is trying to put out there. And then finally, have a sense check. Once you've put the document together, go back to your stakeholders and put it to them and say, well, does this make sense? Do the words make sense? Is the order of it logical? Is it representative of what we do? Is there anything that we've missed? Or is there anything in there that we've prioritized that isn't so important to you? What is important to you, and have we included it on there? So doing that final sense check is going to be a really important part of the process. But on the whole, I think it's absolutely fantastic start, really strong foundations there. A few things that we can tweak, and as you said, the indicators are a work in progress anyhow, but really strong start, and I can't wait to see the final document.